Hey, what's up, everybody? I hope that you had a nice weekend, that you're feeling refreshed and rejuvenated. It's really snowing here. We have a blizzard, I think is the technical term. So we're all cooped up, and my cats are a little ornery, but I'm very happy to be here. And well, I think that you'll have a good time today discussing the legislature. It's our first meeting of, I think, what, six, where we'll technically be discussing the legislature. There really is no institution more synonymous with democracy than the legislature, the parliament. So we'll talk about the origin of the modern legislature, and we'll treat it as an institution that came about in time under specific circumstances before gradually beginning to talk in a more abstract and more conceptual way about what a legislature is. So today will be kind of that genealogy, or that discussion of the legislature and how it emerged and where it came about. Before we do that, though, I actually have this little exercise that I want to do with you, where we take a look at some data or some information that captures some of the differences that matter to us when we talk about the legislature as an institution. Now, before we get to all of that, let's just discuss our agenda for studying democratic institutions. The main questions that we approach this analysis with are as follows. First, how did the core institutions of democracy originate and evolve? And what are their functions and characteristics? So what do they do? Where did they come about? Where do we trace them to? And how did they evolve, and how were they maintained or changed once they originated? Second, how do different institutions impact democratic governance? So, for example, are parliamentary democracies more stable than presidential ones? Are proportional representation systems more representative than majoritarian ones? This is where we begin to evaluate the performance of different kinds of institutions and how well they do in satisfying the different objectives that we hold up and that we aspire to, what kinds of outcomes they produce, their stability, their representativeness, the quality of the democracy under those institutions. And this is important because this is where the differences that we observe become really important. The differences allow us to critique and scrutinize the differences in the institutions themselves. And so, where two countries are different in some area, we might ask, for example, well, does one type of institution perform better than the other in terms of these outcomes of interest, representativeness or responsiveness or stability, or whatever? And then finally, on a more subjective and a more substantive level, do democratic institutions contribute to society what they're supposed to contribute, whether they are proportional or substantive uh, institutions, whether the things that we're considering fall under either heading, whether the differences are majoritarian or proportional or parliamentary or presidential. Do democratic institutions in general do what they're supposed to do? And this is where we begin to get into deeper questions about democracy and what it does for us, and what kinds of outcomes democracy produces. This is an evaluation in a debate that gets us to a much deeper level. It's one that we'll take on to some degree here, but we're really mainly interested in evaluating democratic institutions on the basis of what they do in their performance. And so the first one that we'll evaluate is the legislature. And as I said, we'll spend a couple weeks on the legislature because it is so synonymous with democracy. And really, democracy emerged when the legislature did. And I'll talk in more detail about what we mean. And if you did the reading, you've seen as well that the origin of the legislature was also the origin of modern democracy as we know it in the contemporary, the modern world, the sort of post-classical world. That is the world that we basically take back to 1492, when a person named Columbus apparently discovered a certain world. Now that's just an arbitrary or a period or a point in time that we'll use to think of the modern period. But as you know already, democracy and contemporary democracy, modern democracy, really is relatively new. It's a form of government that we can only trace back a few hundred years at the very most. So the very first institution of democracy during this period is the legislature. And before we get into that historical discussion and we talk about the emergence and the origin of the legislature, I want to actually just do an exercise with you where we take a look at first an example of a legislature, and that is the Uruguayan Senate. Now that's one house in the legislative branch of the Uruguayan political system. There's also a chamber of representatives, but this is the Senate. And in Uruguay, the Senate is a very important institution because along with the Chamber of Representatives, the legislature has been very active and very productive since the transition to democracy a few decades ago. They've legalized abortion, they've legalized marijuana and other drugs, they've ended amnesties for individuals who committed abuses against of human rights during the military regime. They undertook other reforms and other changes that were very progressive in nature and very productive and helped to consolidate democracy in Uruguay. Uruguay is a good example of a very productive Senate or a very productive chamber of a Congress or a legislature. And if you take a look at Uruguay, the Congress in 2019, the most recent election, the results of that election gave you a Congress with a composition as follows. On the one hand, the Senate had four parties who between them shared 30 seats. The Chamber of Representatives had 99 seats and seven parties, whom among them distributed this many seats. And this is the composition of those two chambers of the Congress in Uruguay. If you take a look at neighboring Peru, you'll find that the Congress, first of all, looks very different. There's a single body, and there are many, many more parties. The composition of the Congress in Peru is very diverse and very fragmented by comparison. Both countries, of course, democracies, both with legislative institutions. It's just that the legislatures look very different. And in particular, they look different in terms of their composition and in terms of their actual institutional setup. Again, Uruguay having two chambers, fewer parties who share fewer seats and distribute seats differently. And in Peru, a single house with many parties who distribute among them seats relatively evenly. Now, the key differences that emerge, those institutional differences, the composition, the setup, the fragmentation, those are important differences that we would then maybe critique or scrutinize or analyze to try to answer questions about the responsiveness or the representativeness or the productivity of these legislatures. We would ask questions like, is the Peruvian Congress less productive or more productive as a result of having more parties? Is the Uruguayan Congress less productive as a result of having two bodies as opposed to one? Does the fragmentation of the vote across many parties in Peru make it more difficult to reach consensus? Or is that unimportant? And are there other factors that might affect the productivity or the stability or the outcomes of legislative proceedings in the Congress in Peru? These institutional differences become meaningful when we begin to ask questions about the outcomes that they produce and whether those differences have something to do with the differences in the outcomes that we might observe. Now, I can tell you that it is true that the Uruguayan Congress tends to be far more productive than the Peruvian Congress. In fact, many people joke that the one thing that the Peruvian Congress can agree on is impeaching presidents. And in Peru, there are very, very fraught, intense relationships between presidents and the Congress. And in fact, it's difficult to remember the last president in Peru who wasn't impeached by the Congress. I think it's something like the last 4 or 5, or even more than that, presidents have been impeached. And similarly, the Peruvian Congress hasn't been particularly productive in terms of legislating and pushing through necessary democratic and social and economic reforms in a country that desperately needs them to continue to grow and continue to prosper. In Uruguay, by contrast, there's been much more productivity, and it's difficult to say if if the institutional differences account for the varying outcomes. But from our perspective, from an institutional perspective, these differences do matter, and we would look at them and examine them and try to evaluate them and understand if those differences account for some of the differences in the performance of those democratic institutions. Uriel says, so if I understand correctly, Peru doesn't have a Senate and only has a Congress. So they call it the Congress. There's just a single house. Technically, it's just an assembly. It doesn't have a Senate or doesn't have a house. They just call it, I think, if I understand correctly, they call it just the assembly. It's just a single house. It's a unicameral, as we would put it. It's the Peruvian Congress. Uruguay, by contrast, has both a Senate and a lower chamber. And so that's a key institutional difference that emerges when you compare the countries. Justin says, so it looks like Peru has a wide range of representative parties in Congress. Yeah, so the vote is very fragmented in Peru, Justin. So the composition of the institution, it's very fragmented, as we would put it, because many parties distribute the vote amongst themselves. And not only that, but they distribute the 130 available seats relatively evenly. As you can see, there are some parties who have more than others, but all parties have a relatively similar number of seats. And so what that means then is the fragmentation of the vote often makes it difficult to assemble multi-party coalitions because they all have different interests and different constituencies, and it becomes very difficult to put together a solid majority that doesn't fall apart very quickly because of conflicts among the parties inside the coalition. In Uruguay, by contrast, take a look. You have only 3 parties who really even have a viable number of seats. You have the Broad Front, the Colorado Party, and then I'm forgetting the name of this party, but 30, 13, and 42 respectively in the chamber. And then in the Senate, you have 13, 10, and 4, but really it's just the Broad Front and then this party, 13 and 10, who have the largest shares. This is a very different composition than, say, Peru, where many parties have a relatively even number of seats. So those differences matter a great deal because it makes it hard to form coalitions. Efren says, does Peru have a multi-party system? So Peru has many parties. Well, we should be clear, Uruguay is a multi-party system as well. Uruguay has something that's closer to a sort of bimodal or a 2-party system because they typically have 2 large coalitions that have the largest shares. But both countries are multi-party systems. Peru is a very fragmented multi-party system. It has many parties. In any given Congress, you'll find at least often 12 or more parties who have seats in the Congress. Now that's just the parties in Congress, the legislative parties. Outside of Congress, there are many more parties. In Peru, the effective number of parties, that is the number of parties who compete and are viable and who get a measurable amount of representation in the Congress, is relatively high, much higher than in Uruguay, where it's like 2 or 3. In Peru, it's often as high as 5 or 6. Christopher says, could those impeachments in Peru be due to actual corruption? Well, It's complicated. Corruption in Peru, and first of all, is rampant both in the legislature as well as is often in the executive. But we can't paint them all with the same brush. And really, oftentimes these impeachments in Peru have a lot to do with institutional rivalry. The executive very often is unable to get support from the Congress because of rivalries between the executive and the Congress. And so that's often why parties in Congress can agree on impeaching the president, but not agree on supporting their bills or their reforms or how to even amend the proposals that the executive puts forward. Is it due to corruption? Not necessarily. Some presidents in Peru have not been necessarily super corrupt, but they've been impeached. Some may have been corrupt, certainly, but the rivalries that exist between the institutions, I think, often are a better explanation of the way that they behave, at least in the Peruvian context. But there are many possible explanations. And I don't want to suggest that there's only one reason that 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 this is why this happens. Justin says, would you also classify Peru's Congress as proportional? Because I know that it is brought up in a lot of the readings and how it affects democracy given the amount of parties Peru has. Well, to tell you honestly, I can't say or remember off the top of my head exactly what type of electoral system Peru has. I think it does have a proportional representation system, but the fragmentation of the system isn't strictly due to proportional representation. It also has to do with geography and social and group and often ethnic differences that exist and class differences that exist across geographic regions in Peru. So there are many factors. We're not necessarily explaining the fragmentation right now. We're just saying that the fragmentation itself exists and that it does become a meaningful institutional difference when we compare Peru to, say, Uruguay. And so, yeah, so Jeffrey points out that Uruguay has a unicameral chamber where Peru has a bicameral chamber, and that's a meaningful institutional difference that might become relevant when we analyze the performance of the legislature. Michael says, my family is from Peru, and I believe everyone is required to vote for every election, and if not, they have to pay a fee. So compulsory voting does exist in Peru. That's something that we might address later in the class. Jeffrey says that's similar to Australia. So the key institutional differences that you've already identified here are as follows. Peru has a unicameral legislature. Uruguay has a bicameral legislature. In Peru, there's a high degree of fragmentation of the legislative vote across many parties who have relatively even number of seats. In Uruguay, by contrast, there's a much lower fragmentation of the vote across fewer parties who between them share a larger number of seats. Now, those differences might matter a great deal to the productivity or the stability of the legislature, might have a bearing or an impact on the relationship between the legislature and the executive. We'll learn about that later in the class. For now, I think that that's a useful way for us to introduce the nature of the democratic legislature as an elected body with political parties who represent constituents and who compose the Congress as a whole in the institutions that compose that Congress. Now, the question of the rise of the democratic legislature is an equally important one because these legislatures in Uruguay and Peru and everywhere else, they don't just emerge from thin air. They don't come out of nowhere. They come from a process and they have an origin and a circumstance and a context, just like any other institution does. And just like we did with democracy itself, we're going to introduce the legislature by sort of putting it in historical time and putting its origin in context. The question for us then is, how did the modern democratic legislature originate and evolve? And the story, interestingly, really takes us to the early modern period in Europe, and specifically in England. And this is a period where peasants are moving from the countryside to urban areas, and the nobility or the gentry, the landed nobility, are becoming increasingly involved in commerce in the towns. And this is a transition or a change from purely agricultural activity that took place primarily in rural areas in the countryside. And this stimulation of commercial activity in the towns was an important shift. It was a social and an economic shift, but it was also a transformation that would carry about and bring about political transformations of an important scope. And those transformations would themselves create the foundation for representative government in England. And then the question for us is, how could those economic and social changes have brought about democracy and the democratic legislature? What are the links between these structural and social changes, the emergence of commerce, the change from rural to urban commercial activity? How did they bring about democracy? That's what we'll focus on. And this is how we'll begin to introduce the democratic legislature and the rise of the parliament. And this transformation has everything to do with the change in the observability of assets. And bear with me here, this is something that will take piece by piece. When activity primarily took place in the countryside, it was very, very easy for the state or the crown to observe that activity and to expropriate or take from economic producers their revenues or funds generated by their activity, because they could easily see how much acreage they had or how much or what they were producing. This is an example of easily observable assets, agricultural production. But the shift towards commercial activity in towns and towards wool producers and merchants and financial intermediaries and bankers was a shift towards assets that were much harder to observe. It was a shift from easily observable agricultural assets to more obscure, hideable, more hideable assets, assets that couldn't be easily traced or seen, at least compared to the fields and the agricultural products and produce that associated with that former form of economic production and social organization. This shift to more difficult to observe assets was really, really important, because it meant that suddenly economic actors that previously had to pay heavy taxes to the crown, who could easily observe how much was being produced, could now hide their assets. And it would make it much, much more difficult for the state to take or to tax those assets. Suddenly, it was very, very easy for much of economic activity to take place sort of undercover, or sort of in a way that was difficult to observe or not in direct view of state actors. And so those wool producers, those bankers, those merchants, they could hide their income, they could hide their revenue, they could hide their assets, they could hide their activity. Whereas earlier on, the farmers and the agricultural producers could not easily hide their activity, and were therefore much more vulnerable to taxes and to expropriation by the crown, who needed those funds and that revenue to fight wars and to survive and to promote their own policy objectives and to carry on as they'd been. Now, the crown still needed money because it's fighting wars. And not just that, but it's in an increasingly precarious position because the costliness of wars, both domestic and civil, in the need to finance those conflicts with revenues generated inside the state. Now, to get revenue and to get money, the crown now had to negotiate with the new economic elites. They had to enter into a negotiation with them to try to extract the same amount of money and more that they could previously from the old economic elite who were tied primarily to agriculture and the land. Now, in return for paying their taxes, the elites demanded limits to state predation. They said basically, if you want us to pay your taxes, you need to stop taking from us, stop expropriating our assets, stop taking too much of our income. You need to be very limited and constrained in your exploitation of our activity. And we want some promise or some guarantee or some certainty, some hedge against that predatory behavior that we're so accustomed to. We don't want to turn over all of our income to you. We don't want to turn over our assets to you. We want to be protected from that expropriation. Now, the new elites got what they wanted. The crown conceded, and there was a settlement that came about that resulted in the supremacy of parliament over the crown. And in particular, it resulted in the vesting in the parliament of the power of the purse, the power to control the financing of projects or the pursuits or the undertakings of the crown. And this is the emergence of the modern democratic legislature with powers equal to or greater than an executive within an institutional context. The parliament is representing the new economic elite in this environment, in this context, in this moment, and it's doing so in an institutional relationship with the executive or the crown. And it is using its new power to sort of check the crown, if you will, or finance the crown only to the extent that the crown doesn't predate or overtax or take the assets of the new economic elite. Now, there's a similar story that's often given to account for the rise of the democratic legislature in England. And it goes like this. Now that economic actors could hide their assets, the crown had to credibly promise not to extort them. That is, not to take too much of their income or to take their assets. And one way to do this was to give Parliament power to check the crown. Now, this is a very, very similar story. The only difference is that the crown in this case is trying to credibly promise not to extort economic elites, and so it's taking it upon itself to give Parliament that power. In the first story, the economic elites are demanding through Parliament to have this power and to have this protection from expropriation and overtaxation. Both stories do an excellent job of accounting for the origin of the legislature in this political environment as a sort of mechanism for the representation of this new economic elite and for the representation of the elite in particular in its relationship with the crown, which hitherto had relied on the overtaxation or the expropriation of elites, primarily in the countryside, to finance its wars. So both of these stories explain the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And this was an event that saw the creation of modern parliamentary democracy in Britain. This was a critical juncture, if you will, or a moment that kind of birthed democracy in Britain and gave rise to modern parliamentary democracy through this new balance of powers between a newly empowered parliament and a crown on the other hand. And so here's a representation of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Now, in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, it was William III and Mary II who became co-rulers in England after the overthrow of King James II. It was they who signed the English Bill of Rights in 1689, and it was that document that gave Parliament power over the monarchy. And so that was the specific sort of legal and political and constitutional process that went hand in hand with this this origin of modern parliamentary democracy in Britain. Now, what I want you to notice about this is that baked into this story are a few details that really become important. And so, leading up to the conflict, the crown must have confiscated the assets of a segment of the elite represented by parliament. Otherwise, they wouldn't have taken it upon themselves to use parliament to exert influence to try to constrain the crown and gain the power to represent the new economic elite and finance the crown through its relationship, its institutional relationship with the crown. But what that meant more specifically was that the economic elite were faced with three choices, three alternative options. First, they could exit, they could disinvest in the economy. That is, they could leave. That doesn't seem like a realistic choice, though, because they're already invested, and that could be very, very costly for them to pick up and leave and to pull out what's already been there for some time and what they already rely on and is already set up. They could voice or they could petition the crown for protections against confiscation or expropriation in exchange for a promise to continue investing their assets. This is more of a negotiation. Or they could exhibit loyalty and they could keep investing in paying taxes despite confiscation and expropriation. Now, they clearly opted to negotiate their way to a better position and they chose to use voice. But their leverage came from the fact that they had assets that were not easily observable and that they could hide very, very easily from the crown, who they knew needed money and who they knew needed money desperately so because of wars that were generating mounting losses and that the crown was actually not winning at the time. And so this is the political context in the sort of strategic context for the emergence of the democratic legislature. This is the sort of set of circumstances that gave rise to this institution, which we can understand as a product of this contemporary, this modern period that began in 1492 and is so distinct in its circumstances and we can think of as a period of time in human history more broadly. This is a very interesting question, the question of the origin of the legislature. And I want to pose to you a question that will incorporate the lenses and the perspectives that we've already incorporated in the class and used in discussion. And those are the historical institutionalism, rational choice institutionalism, and sociological institutionalism perspectives. Remember that these are three different perspectives for understanding or assessing institutions and evaluating or analyzing their creation, their origin. Remember that they have different ideas about where these institutions come from and what they do and how they're created and why they're created and who creates them. So I want to pose a question to you, which is, does historical institutionalism, rational choice institutionalism, or sociological institutionalism provide the best explanation of the rise of the democratic legislature in England? And I'm curious if you can consider the reading done for this week as well, and if you can kind of think about the circumstances surrounding the origin of the legislature in England. What perspective fits best with this story in England? Is this a story of historical institutionalism? Is it a story of rational choice institutionalism? Or is it a story of sociological institutionalism? And so sit back for a moment and think about this. And I would like you to give this a moment and then tell me in a direct message on the chat. getting some interesting. Jeffrey, there are two stories because there are different interpretations of the evidence. They're relatively similar stories, though, so there's a lot of agreement about key details. But there are two stories because there are some alternative interpretations of some of that information. Getting a lot of answers rolling in here. Also think through this too. So many of you are providing your answer, but I'd like you to think about and explain why you think one better explains it than another. Getting some good responses. So I'd like to read some of your responses, and if you're still thinking through this, no problem. Well, actually, let me give you another moment here because I think that this is such a useful exercise, and I don't want to cut you all off. This is really great. You guys are thinking through this in a really excellent way, and that's what I love about these historical vignettes. They give us a chance to see the origin and the circumstances, but we can also interpret that story in different ways. And there are some interesting variations in your responses. And I'm going to tell you right up front, I think that there are valid interpretations for different theories here. And so let me begin to read some of your responses and incorporate some of this. So Efren says that rational choice institutionalism might work best because there's cooperation between the elites and the crown. They're reaching a compromise and an agreement. Absolutely. So then the question for Efren becomes, what gain are the two sides trying to get through their agreement, right? So why are they compromising and why are they agreeing? And so what benefit are they trying to obtain individually through their cooperation? That's always the key question for a rational choice institutionalist account. That the question is, what is the benefit or what gain are they trying to obtain through their cooperation and through their cooperative institution building? And for those of you saying rational choice, that is the key question. And I want to press you to think about that question. Any rational choice institutionalist analysis has to answer that question. What is the individual gain that the actors are trying to obtain through their cooperative institution building? Giovanni says they wanted to solve the collective issue of avoiding taxes. So certainly the new economic elite, the merchants, the wool producers, the bankers, the intermediaries, they certainly wanted to limit their tax burden and how much they were turning over to the crown. In that regard, they're working together collectively to try to use the parliament in their relationship and in their conflict with the crown. But there is also that question of the crown and what the crown is doing, right? And what the interest or the the desire or the objective of the crown is, and maybe what the motivation of the crown is. So maybe to Giovanni, the consideration for all of us is, with our rational choice institutionalist analysis, how do we incorporate all of the actors? How do we incorporate the crown into that analysis too? Christopher says historical, rational, and social, because the social history brings the evolution through rational, pragmatic, progressive society. So we'd want to talk though about what the actors involved, what their interests are, what the social codes might be that they're responding to. If it's historical, what might the historical circumstance be that creates this possibility? Karen says historical. If it's historical, what is the critical juncture, and what is the moment or the episode that is lifting the normal constraints on action? Every historical institutionalist account needs to answer that question, in addition to saying, what are the particular power relations and ideas that made this outcome or this institution creation possible. So I don't deny that there's certainly a role for like a historical component here. There's kind of a critical juncture in the conflict that was waged over this, the lifting of constraints, the fact that the crown had been weakened substantially as a result of its own wars and undertakings. Jeffrey says the elites had to cooperate and establish an institution that will check the crown and limit his or her power. Again, the question remains, what about the crown? What is the crown trying to do or obtain through cooperating to establish this new institution with the parliament? Because the crown is part of this story too. Nina says, I think the rise is due to rational choice institutionalism, because the elites' choice voice, which was a much better and rational decision to make for the elites financially and politically. But we want to talk about the crown as well, and what the crown might have been doing. Uriel says, I think perhaps historical institutionalism, because all parties involved, the crown, the elites, and the economic elites, wanted to maintain a level of power and not give up too much. Interesting, Uriel. So this is a good, sophisticated view of the situation. We have not just the crown, but the new economic elites, as well as maybe even the traditional elites in the parliament itself. And we know that there's sort of a relationship between the new economic elites and the old ones, because they both have a shared potential benefit in reducing or limiting state predation and through some institutional way. It's possible that all of those actors have a motivation, but I think that, to your point, if they all have a shared motivation to cooperate, if they're all involved in an effort to maintain their power, that sounds a lot like rational choice institutionalism. Because historical institutionalism assumes that there's always some asymmetry of power, or that some group is stronger than another. I think that there's sort of a bargain or a negotiation here that might point to a rational choice kind of, but clearly there's also a historical component, because there's a role for circumstance too. Jeffrey says, I'm interested to hear Karen's answer since she stated historical. Justin says, I believe historical, given the way the people saw that they were being treated by the crown, and the crown may have felt as if they needed to give the people the right to say. In return, that is why the monarchy doesn't exactly make or are no longer involved in policymaking, and rather let the parliament and the people decide through voting. Jake says, I think it's historical institutionalism, because the legislature was built in order to fit the interests of the people during that time, as the people wanted more say in governance in exchange for their taxes. So it does appear that the new economic elites certainly have the upper hand, right? Santiago says, as stated in the slide before, the elites had three choices in which these choices really didn't help their cause. Therefore, they rationalized and used their voice to get themselves into a better position and coming to an agreement with the crown. So there's sort of this bargain, this negotiation that seems like it's kind of this rational equilibrium for the two. Karen says, I think historical, because development and advancement of an institution always considers the beginning and strives to build more and better. I think the important people in society, such as the merchants and the wool growers who use the land for their resources, were fighting to get their fair share, just as the elites were doing. And so maybe those particular actors had an advantage at that moment that gave them the ability to impose their preferred system. The question I have for all of you is, did someone have the upper hand in the negotiation between the new economic elite represented by Parliament and the Crown? If one of those two had the upper hand, then it's more difficult for us to say that it's rational choice institutionalism, because rational choice institutionalism doesn't account for power relations. Remember that it really treats actors as sort of being even-handed, fully informed, and really cooperative, right? Willing to cooperate, work together to secure some outcome through institution building and cooperation that they could not obtain otherwise, right? Some benefit, some return, or some positive gain that they could not obtain without cooperative institution building. But if there's an upper hand that was to be had in this situation, then it's more difficult for us to say that it was a pure example of rational choice institutionalism. Who had the upper hand? Do you think that the Parliament had the upper hand, since it was representing the new economic elite who had hideable assets that were more difficult to tax, precisely at a moment when the Crown needed revenue more than ever before? Did someone have the upper hand in this case? Was it the Parliament, do you think? If we say that it was the Parliament, if we acknowledge that there may have been an asymmetry of power, well, what we're saying is that there were power relations involved, in that at this historical moment in time, the power relations didn't really work in the Crown's favor. They actually worked in the favor of the new economic elite. They worked in favor of the Parliament. They worked in favor of this new group, this new social group, who benefited from their hideable assets and were able to leverage their position in this relationship with the Crown, who desperately needed their money, but who could not expropriate their assets and overtax them as it traditionally had. This to me sounds like historical institutionalism, right? But there's also obviously a role for the Crown, in the sense that the Crown does have the capacity to empower the Parliament and agree to a new institutional arrangement in which the Parliament has essentially equal or greater authority. Do you see how there's both a role for rational choice institutionalism as well as historical institutionalism in facilitating, in kind of explaining this picture, this story? The Crown does have an interest in getting revenue and does have the power to empower the Parliament and create an institutional arrangement that might give it the money that it needs at the expense of giving up a little bit of its authority. You can see then how historical institutionalism and rational choice institutionalism can help us to understand this story. Now, it's possible that sociological institutionalism might have also been a useful explanation. It's just that the story that I've presented to you doesn't seem as consistent with that perspective on the surface. I would grant that there might be other interpretations that I'm not aware of, but I think that the lesson here is that we can very usefully apply multiple perspectives to interpret this evidence. We can see that there are motivations, there are power relations involved, but there's also cooperation. There's also a desire to mediate conflict in pursuit of gain, right? Cooperative institution building to facilitate individual gain. Jeffrey says the real question is which choice institutionalism is the right one. Well, I would encourage you not to think of it necessarily that way. We can use all three of these productively to shed light on and explain particular institutional choices, particular institution creations, if you will. I don't know if these are prescriptive per se, right? As in, I don't know if they have a normative overtone. They really have more application as explanatory tools. But if your question is which one is the right explanation for this story, I think that it's somewhere between historical institutionalism and rational choice institutionalism. I think both of them have something to say here. Christopher says Crown had to bow down. So yeah, touche, right? There certainly is kind of a role for power relations, but the Crown also had some potential benefit from bowing down in the sense that they could potentially get the money they needed if it did involve, giving up some authority. And then Christopher says, avoid the Maris Revolution like French overturn in France. Okay, so this is where we're going to wrap it up for today. We're going to continue with this discussion on Wednesday, where we will continue to deal with the legislature, and we'll deal with some more concrete and some more abstract questions about the functions of the legislature in a democratic society. But thank you very much, everybody, for being here. And that does it for today. I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dina.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Juan.
Thank you, Professor. See you on Wednesday.
Thanks, Max. You too.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you, Samantha. You too.